The sequence of events here is what gets you. Not any single moment, but the chain. Each link pulling the next one into place until you end up somewhere that genuinely didn't feel possible 5 years ago. It started, reportedly, with weeks of quiet outreach. People inside the Trump administration making calls, sending messages, trying to get Joe Rogan back on board. Not because of some urgent national issue. Not because of a policy emergency, because the relationship had gone cold and they needed it warm again. That's the starting point. A White House reportedly devoting staff time and political capital to repairing a fractured relationship with a podcast host. That's where this story begins. And it worked. Rogan showed up at the White House, photographed, documented, the whole thing. Then, not long after that, there he was at a UFC event, running up to Trump with this open, enthusiastic energy that told you everything you needed to know about how that conversation had gone. The tension, whatever it was gone. The deal had been made. And the terms of that deal are the part worth slowing down on. Because from what's been reported and discussed, a significant piece of what brought Rogan back wasn't political alignment. It wasn't shared values. It wasn't a handshake on foreign policy or trade or any of the things that actual governments are supposed to care about. The piece that moved the needle, according to what's come out publicly, is that the administration agreed to clear a path for certain psychedelic substances, the kind Rogan has been publicly championing on his show for years, through the FDA approval process. So the logic that connected all of this was roughly, Rogan is out, Trump wants him back, Rogan has this thing he wants, Trump's people agree to move on that thing, Rogan comes back. That's the chain. And when you lay it out flat like that, it's almost hard to process how casually extraordinary it is. Let's sit with that for a second. An administration shaping its regulatory priorities, at least in part, around what a podcast host wanted in exchange for returning to their orbit. The FDA, which exists specifically to evaluate the safety and efficacy of substances before they reach the public, is now adjacent to a negotiation between a reality TV president and a man who used to dare people to eat insects for money. That sentence is not satire. That sentence is the news. Now, to be fair, and this is important to say clearly, psychedelics as a class of substances are not without legitimate scientific interest. The research into psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine for conditions like severe depression and PTSD has produced genuinely compelling results in clinical settings. Peer-reviewed studies, not anecdotes. Controlled environments, trained clinicians, monitored outcomes. There is a real and growing body of evidence that certain psychedelic-assisted therapies have meaningful potential for people who haven't responded to conventional treatment. That's worth saying because the issue isn't whether psychedelics can have value. The issue is the mechanism by which they're being pushed toward wider approval. Because the path that the science would take, careful, rigorous, with psychiatrists and researchers guiding policy, is a very different path than the one that seems to be in play here. One is driven by clinical evidence. The other is driven by a podcast host's personal enthusiasm and a political bargain that needed to get done. Those are not the same thing. And letting them get blurred together is how you end up with a regulatory system that stops being about science and starts being about who's in the room and what they want. Joe Rogan has been saying for years, on his show repeatedly, that he doesn't really align with either party, that he values independent thought, that he's not some political operator. He built a massive chunk of his audience on that image. The guy who sits in the middle, asks hard questions, holds everyone accountable. The guy who'll criticize the left one episode and the right the next. That was the brand. And then his relationship with the administration goes cold. The administration sends people to smooth it over. They dangle something he personally wants, and he's back at the White House posing for photos. Whatever was principled about that position evaporated somewhere between the phone call and the handshake. The interesting thing is that most people who follow Rogan closely probably aren't even that surprised. His critics saw it coming. And even some of his longtime listeners have had to quietly acknowledge that the guy who claims to operate outside politics keeps somehow ending up inside it. Usually on one specific side. Usually when there's something to gain or something to protect. The "I'm just asking questions" posture has a pretty consistent direction to its questions. What makes the whole thing stranger is the context around Trump's outreach. Around the same time this effort to win Rogan back was reportedly happening, Trump had gone after a whole list of conservative media voices on Truth Social, publicly, by name. People who had been in his corner, who had carried water for him, who had been loyal through everything. He went after them anyway. Because that's how this works. Loyalty in that orbit flows in one direction, and the moment someone says something that doesn't fit the moment, they're out. So he burned those bridges, which narrowed the circle, which made pulling Rogan back more urgent, which led to the deal, which led to Rogan at the White House again. One action feeding directly into the next. And here's what that tells you about the actual power structure at play. Joe Rogan right now is genuinely valuable to Trump. More valuable, apparently, than some of the people who had been loyal to him for years. That's not because Rogan is particularly insightful or accurate or responsible, it's because he has reach. He has an audience that is large enough and sufficiently in the demographic Trump needs that maintaining access to that audience is worth political and regulatory concessions. That's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Rogan's influence, diminished somewhat from its 2024 peak but still real, is worth enough to the administration that they're making deals around it, which means the listeners, whether they know it or not, are the actual commodity in this transaction. Their attention is what's being bought and sold. Rogan's platform is the delivery mechanism, and Trump's team is essentially purchasing access to it. It's worth noting that Rogan's reach probably has declined some since the election cycle. The audience that came to him during that period, many of them younger men who were politically engaged for the first time, has started to fragment. Some of them have moved toward people with more coherent and consistent views. Some of them have just moved on. The numbers don't lie. And even Rogan would probably acknowledge that the post-election moment is different from the pre-election one. But a bit weaker than before still leaves him with one of the most listened to platforms in the country. And in a media landscape where traditional outlets have lost significant ground, that kind of unmediated reach is genuinely valuable. Trump's team understands that, even if some of the people around Trump don't fully grasp why it matters. What's striking when you step back is how completely transactional the whole thing is, and how little anyone involved is even trying to hide that. There's no pretense that Rogan returned because of a genuine meeting of minds on policy. There's no cover story about shared principles. The shape of what happened is right there in the open. The administration wanted something, Rogan wanted something. Both parties got what they came for. Done. Which raises the question of what that means for anyone who still takes Rogan seriously as some kind of independent voice. Because independent voices don't come back when they're called. They don't make their return conditional on regulatory favors. They don't get photographed at the White House after a reconciliation deal. The word independent stops applying the moment you start negotiating the terms of your own endorsement. And look, Rogan's audience has always been a mix. There are people who listen for the long-form conversations, the science guests, the comedy, the martial arts stuff. Not everyone who puts that podcast on is doing it for political content. But the political influence that Rogan has built, and that Trump's team is so eager to tap into, comes from those listeners too, whether they think of themselves as political or not. The podcast doesn't separate its audiences. The deal that got made affects all of them. There's also something worth saying about what this moment represents for how political influence actually works now. The White House didn't approach a senator to patch things up. They didn't reach out to a major newspaper editorial board or a network anchor. They went to a guy with a microphone, a guest chair, and 100 million downloads a month. That's where the influence lives now. That's where the deal needed to get made. This isn't a complaint about podcasting as a medium. Long-form audio conversation can be a genuinely valuable format. It allows for depth that a cable news segment never will. But the format's potential doesn't automatically make its most prominent practitioner trustworthy, principled, or good at what they claim to do. Rogan gets credit for the format. The format doesn't give him credit he hasn't earned. And what he hasn't earned, what this whole episode underlines pretty clearly, is the image of someone who holds firm when it costs him something. The test of what someone actually believes is what they do when walking away would be easier, or staying would require something uncomfortable. Rogan failed that test quietly, and without much apparent internal conflict, if the way he showed back up is any indication. The FDA piece of this is going to get lost in the broader story, but it probably shouldn't, because if there's a lasting consequence to what happened here, it might be in that direction. Drug policy in this country has been failing people for decades. Overcriminalization, lack of access to legitimate treatment, a system that is better at punishing addiction than addressing it. There is a real argument for reforming how the FDA approaches certain therapeutic substances, and that argument deserves a serious policy process. What it doesn't deserve is to get bundled into a deal between a podcast host and a president who needed his social media numbers back up. Because that's how you get policy that sounds like it's about science, but is actually about optics. Approved fast, understood poorly, implemented sloppily, and walked back when it becomes politically inconvenient. The people who might have genuinely benefited from thoughtful psychedelic-assisted therapy policy are not the ones who are going to benefit from this version of it. That's the part of the chain reaction that bothers me most when I think about it. Not the absurdity of the visuals, though the visuals are absurd. Not the brazenness of the transaction, though it is completely brazen. It's that real policy that affects real people, is getting shaped by what it took to get a podcast host back in a good mood. The two men at the center of this both came from entertainment. One hosted a show where contestants ate live bugs. One hosted a show where contestants got fired in a boardroom. Neither of them came to their current positions through any kind of public service, expertise, or demonstrated understanding of the systems they're now influencing. And yet, here they are, sitting across from each other in the Oval Office, making arrangements that touch everything from drug regulation to media influence to what millions of Americans will think about their government over the next several years. There was a period, not long ago at all, when that sentence would have sounded like the premise of a satirical novel that went too far. Something you'd read and think, okay, clever, but come on. The 18 years ago version of this conversation would have confused people. Fear Factor host and The Apprentice host at the White House doing a drug deal. Not metaphorically, an actual negotiation involving the FDA. People would have needed a minute. We don't get a minute. This is just what's happening. And the pace at which things that should be shocking have become routine is its own story. One that probably deserves its own conversation, because the normalization of all of this is as significant as any single event within it. For now, though, the chain is what it is. Trump needed Rogan. Rogan had a price. The price got paid. Rogan came back. And somewhere in a regulatory office, someone is now figuring out how to make the paperwork match the deal that was struck in a room most of them weren't in. That's the state of things. No embellishment needed.